Welcome to the Sensible Socialist Podcast, a podcast for the rational left.
We need to unite and work together if we're all going to get through this. Sounds like socialism to me.
The amount of people I see talking about socialism positively is actually staggering.
Do you really think that a proletarian revolution is just around the corner in America?
Grab your pitchforks and stab your mayor.
Your hero, Obama.
He's not my hero. I'm
heroic he comes
idiot. If Bernie Sanders were president, right, and he wanted to bring the same ideas as for socialism into this country, do you think that we would benefit?
Yeah.
But I just told you Venezuela's eating rats.
But I just want people to have health care. I don't want,
Same thing Hugo Chavez.
Oh my god. You people have, worms in your brain, honestly.
Welcome to the Sensible Socialist Podcast, a podcast for the rational left. I'm your host, Kevin Gustafson, and with me today is Dr. Richard Wolff. Dr. Richard Wolff is a professor of economics emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where he taught economics from 1973 to 2008, and currently the visiting professor in the graduate program in international affairs at the New School University in New York City. He's taught at Yale and at the City College of the City University of New York, and is basically one of the world's foremost Marxist economists, a great public speaker, the founder of Democracy at Work, and the author of countless books, including Democracy at Work, The Cure for Capitalism. In this episode, we talk about Dr. Wolff's new book, Understanding Socialism, and talk about the different ways that he sees the different strands of socialism in the 20th century and what they have in common and what they don't have in common and how to understand it. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Dr. Richard Wolff. Thank you, Dr. Wolff, for being on the Sensible Socialist Podcast again.
My pleasure. Glad to be here.
All right, so we would be remiss of us to not say that we were recording this in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, and at a time when the only thing that anybody wants to talk about is the coronavirus and COVID-19 and the responses and whether or not things are good and what a different kind of response would be. And there's all that kind of commentary, which I think is important. But in some ways, I kind of want to reprieve from that for a little bit and talk about something that you had done before this all came out, which was release a wonderful little book called Understanding Socialism. So I want to talk about a little bit about understanding socialism and some of the things that you wrote about in that book. So I think one of the hardest things for most people to explain and to understand is just the basic definition of the word socialism. And I think you'll find as many definitions of socialism as you'll find socialists. So at the beginning of your book, you provide a definition of socialism that's like one of the broadest I've ever heard. So you define it as sort of a yearning for something better than capitalism. Sometimes, other times you say it's like capitalism's shadow, which sort of reminded me of Marx's specter haunting Europe. But why did you pick such a broad definition of socialism? There's many to choose from. This is among the broadest. Why go so broad?
Well, there were a number of reasons that made me do that. One of them was that I actually think that is, when I think about it, and I think of all the people in my long life that I've encountered who define themselves as socialists, I asked myself, well, what is it they have in common? Since, as I got to know them, they often had really strong disagreements about all kinds of things. And this yearning came to me as I was trying to open that book up as a way to capture something that is common to pretty much all of the ones I've ever met. So while it's true, as you say, it's got lots of definitions, that is something almost all of them, I think, would be comfortable endorsing. The second reason I chose it is because it kind of invites a question like what you just said, namely, okay, that's awfully broad, even if I go along with that. I know enough, and I think most people do, about socialism to know that there's lots of disagreements as to what exactly it is or isn't, that those disagreements have led to pretty harsh hostilities among the different definers, if you like.
Yeah.
And so I kind of like that calling this a yearning then provokes the very question that I want to answer, which is, what are these differences? Do they matter? What's at stake when you think of one or the other? And the third reason I did it is I needed to, in some way, from the beginning, undermine the notion that there is some singular thing called socialism that somehow we all agree on. There really isn't.
Yeah,
And
so that is one of like the main points of the book. I think you kind of come to that a few different times, that there really isn't one definition, and it's definitely not the sort of haphazard or propagandistic definition that like socialism is just, when, quote unquote, when the government does stuff.
Right.
So what are those different strands of socialist thinking?
Exactly. I wanted to set up early on a kind of solidarity between me and my reader, that we were going to go on a conversation in this book that really gets at what are the key differences, what are the key main, we can't go through all of them, there's lots of them, but what are the major ways in which people have defined it? And that way people from the beginning understand that we can't shortcut this, but we can't pretend to ourselves or anybody else that there's a simple answer, hey, this is social. You can't do that. And instead of seeing that as some sort of weakness, I try in the book to repeatedly explain, no, that's a sign of strength. The reality is that socialism, whenever you date its beginning, and usually it's early in the 19th century that we kind of think of it as starting, that over the last 200 years, because we're only 200 years later than the early 19th century right now, in that 200 years, this idea, this movement, this concept, socialism, has entered into the life of every country on the face of this earth. That's an amazing achievement in historically a pretty short time. 2 centuries is not a long time in this sort of thing. Usually takes ideas, basic ideas, much longer. It took Christianity much longer to become the powerful voice that it is in the world today. Or maybe I should better say voices, since there's lots of disagreements, obviously, among Christians. And the same is true among Muslims, and on and on and on. And so this is a testimony to the fact that socialism grew very fast and went very far, interacting with people with very different economies, different cultures, different politics, different levels of economic development. To imagine that they would all agree on, that's crazy. It's a sign of socialism's strength that it has been so meaningful to so many people that each of the societies had their own ways of understanding these ideas, whether they got them from a country that was the colonial master. If you were a country in Asia, Africa, Latin America, you probably got these ideas from the colonial country that took you over. Or if you got them instead by reading the original works of, I don't know, Karl Marx or somebody else, however you got it, you used your own filter, your own society, your own consciousness to shape an understanding. And there we are. We have multiple different understandings, which is a testimony to how fast it grew and how meaningful it was to people so otherwise different.
So you do kind of outline some different version or different strands of socialist thinking, particularly in the 20th century. can you briefly sort of paint a picture of some of the different sort of main ideas, the different sort of strands of socialism that came out?
Yes, and there I'm just taking advantage of the work I did in writing the book. I'm going to identify three basic strands, not because they're the only ones, there are others, but because for a whole variety of reasons, I think these are the three big ones, the three that have captured huge numbers of people's imagination. I'll start with the one that is usually considered the most moderate, the most close, if you like, to capitalism, even though it represents, in the minds of the people who believe this, a major step beyond capitalism. And in this view, and by the way, if you're interested, this is the kind of view you will see expressed by Bernie Sanders, by Democratic Socialists of America, not all together, but a large part of them, by social democrats. That's what they call themselves in Europe and in other parts of the world. And here's their basic idea. Capitalism, for them, is very closely wrapped up with the word private. The private enterprise is what dominates in capitalism: private stores, private factories, private enterprises that are organized around offices. An individual or a group of individuals they have property in this enterprise, which means they own the physical plant, they own the raw materials, they own the tools and equipment, and they enter into a contract with employees, people who don't have property in the means of production, and they enter into a wage contract that you come and work in my enterprise, Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, and at the end of Friday, I get to keep whatever it is you help to produce in my workplace, but I'm obligated to give you a payment for the labor you have done. That's your wage. And that's how the system works. It's a collection of interacting private enterprises owned by private individuals, and the interaction occurs through a kind of contractual negotiation. I will provide you with this in exchange for that. And the institution that they use to carry out these negotiations is called a market. So in this view, capitalism is private enterprise and markets. Therefore, for these folks, socialism is in a sense the antithesis, the opposite of private enterprise and markets, by which they mean, in general, that the government steps in and more or less controls or regulates or limits what the private owners can do with their enterprise, and likewise controls, limits, and regulates the negotiations, the market transactions among these enterprises and between them and the public. So socialism becomes government interference, government regulation, government control, lots of words like that. And illustrations for these folks of what socialism is whenever you see the government kind of really getting in there to regulate and control.
Sweden.
Yeah, like Sweden. Or here in the United States, too. Many people will look at something like a minimum wage law and say, okay, that's the government coming in, interfering in a market. Instead of the wages being determined by a negotiation between employer and employee, the government says, well, you can negotiate all day, but you can't go below this number. This is the minimum. Likewise, you can't charge interest on a loan above X, and all kinds of interferences. We all know about them. These are seen by the people who like socialism as a very good way to improve life for people. These socialists are critical that capitalism left to its own devices, or capitalism under the laissez-faire, which is the French word, let it be, let the private sector do its thing. For these socialists, what the private sector does when it does its thing is not acceptable socially. And so they think of themselves as critics of capitalism, and they propose to fix or to improve the flaws and faults of a private capitalism by an aggressive, powerful, complicated government intervention to make things better. If the distribution of income is unfair, the government will fix it by redistributing wealth, for example, through a progressive taxation system or 1,000 other schemes. Socialists have been very creative in coming up with ways of doing that. Mm-hmm. By the way, the enemies of socialism often agree with this definition of socialism. Right. In other words, if you go to a libertarian on the right in this country today, you will hear that they hate all government interventions virtually, right, and identify them with a socialism which they therefore also hate. So Amtrak is socialist, or the post office is socialist, and so forth and so on, because wherever they see government intervention, they, like the socialists they are hostile toward, see socialism. Okay, so that's what goes on in many European countries. We have it in this country. We do have a post office. We do have a minimum wage. We do have limits on interest rates and a whole host of other things. So we have that kind of socialism bit by bit in the United States. It enabled people like Bernie Sanders to teach the American people, both in the 2016 race and now again in the 2020 race, that socialism shouldn't be looked upon as some weird, scary, alien, distant thing, because it's all around us. Mm-hmm. And if you like to have a public park in your community, and if you value the post office when it delivers your packages, well, then you're already halfway there. You like socialism. And people like me, says Bernie, are just going to bring you more of that, and it'll be better for your life. Mm-hmm. So that's one. And Europe, of course, goes much further. In Europe, the interventions by the government go much beyond, in most cases, certainly in countries like Scandinavia or Germany or France or Italy or Spain. I mean, the big countries of Europe are like this. Mm-hmm. They go further than the United States, and that's for a simple reason. Socialism and communism have been much stronger in those countries than they were here. If not before the Second World War, then certainly afterwards. They did not have the kind of McCarthyism and anti-communism for 70 years the way we have had in this country. Their labor unions are stronger. The link between the labor movement and socialism and communism is much more developed, and that's why they go further in this kind of socialism. Okay, now the second kind. The second kind is, I can explain by starting by saying they're dissatisfied with the first kind. They think the first kind doesn't go far enough. That if you leave the control, the ownership and control of private enterprises in the hands of private people, owners, in a corporation, board of directors, major shareholders, that kind of thing, then no matter how much you regulate, they have the resources, namely profits, and every incentive to evade, to weaken, and eventually to simply ignore whatever regulations you put into effect. And these folks like to show you how, for example, the American minimum wage today is worth less in real terms than it was 10, 20, and 30 years ago. You have it on the books, but by having prices go up without the minimum wage being raised, you're in effect undermining it. You know, the Glass-Steagall Act, the attempt to control banks with a government supervision that came out of the Great Depression, 1933, was evaded for decades, then it was weakened, and under Bill Clinton, it was repealed. And literally 8 years later, we had the next crash of our banking system. It's like a joke. So for these people, socialism isn't in place unless you take that next step. You say, no, the government isn't just going to supervise and monitor and regulate. because that isn't enough. You can't get what you need to get beyond capitalism that way. You kind of have to bite the bullet, take a further step. And for them, it's very clear what that step is, actually two steps. Number one, the ownership and control of enterprises has to stop being private. The government should not merely regulate, supervise, and control. The government should own and operate. So here in the United States, it would be the post office or Amtrak or the TVA in that part of the United States, the Tennessee Valley Authority, electric producer. We have some examples, but not many.
Yeah.
And what are the examples of where this was done? Well, the prime example for the first half of the 20th century was the Soviet Union. After World War II, it included Eastern Europe, then China, then Vietnam, Cuba, and so on. In those countries, they did go further. Those people who, by the way, always called themselves socialists. It was the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The political organization that led these countries took the name communist. But that confuses a lot of people.
Right.
They did not think that they were establishing communism. They thought that was a silly idea. That was premature. In the long run, they said to themselves, and to anyone who paid attention, that's where we hope to go. But between here, capitalism, and getting to socialism in a distant future is a long period of time during which we have socialism. And what socialism means is the government is the owner-operator of enterprises, factories, stores, and offices, and the distribution of resources among the enterprises, and the distribution of outputs from enterprises to one another and to the public. That's all going to be done by a government planning apparatus. It's not going to be private negotiations among the private owners, because since you've gotten rid of the private owners, in effect, the government is now the owner, and it's not going to be negotiating with itself. It's going to be planning. And by the way, this shouldn't surprise anybody, because if you ever study institutions like General Electric or General Motors or any major capitalist corporation, that's what it does. The different divisions of these enterprises, if they produce many different things, they don't negotiate with one another. That's why they merged all these different enterprises, so they wouldn't have to go through the market. They don't want to do that. They want a reliable supply of whatever their inputs are. They don't want to waste a lot of time and energy negotiating. They don't want some competitor to come and whisk it away. So they buy the company from which they purchase parts and so on. And so it becomes one big company that has a, guess what, planning apparatus. And so all these socialists say, yes, that planning is what makes a large capitalist corporation efficient, more efficient than little ones. And we're going to get the greatest degree of efficiency if we do it for the whole economy. So that's what we're doing. But because these people disagreed with the first group, in the aftermath of the Soviet Union, 1917, when you had for the first time socialists in political power in a country for years, they made the decision, Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, the leaders there, they made a decision to do this second kind of socialism. They did not let private enterprises in the industry. They did in agriculture, by the way, but they didn't in industry. They took them over. They told the owners, you don't own anything anymore. This is now a government, a tractor factory, or a government software office, or whatever. I mean, they didn't do that in 1917, but you get the idea. And so the government took over, and it said, this is what we think socialism is. That sort of freaked out the other kind of socialists who said, no, we don't like the government to have that much power, so we want to limit it to this, supervise, regulate. And to signal their disagreement, the socialist movement, the global socialist movement in 1917, 18, 1920, debated which way to go, debated what it meant that they had these two very different ideas of socialism, and they decided that they couldn't reach an agreement to overcome the disagreement, and so they took a different name. The people who liked what the Soviet Union did began calling themselves communists. The people who didn't like what the Soviet Union was doing, who wanted socialism to be limited to the government intervening in what was still private enterprise, they held on to the word socialist. Before the years right after the Russian Revolution, that is before, say, 1918 or 19, there was no such thing as a split between communists and socialists. You didn't have Communist Party. It's literally a century old that we have the Communist Party, and it was to signal to the world that we now basically have two kinds of socialism. The original one, that we were all socialists, sort of, and now one that history has forced us to make this distinction, this division. And so the second kind of socialism involves government ownership and planning instead of private ownership and markets. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Now we come to the third one. And the third one is born, if you like, much as the second one was, by a recognition in specific historical circumstances that the first two definitions weren't acceptable. They weren't the only way to do this. Just like the people who called themselves communists were critical of the socialists before them for having been fuzzy on this distinction between government as regulator versus government as owner-operator. So this last one really is a response to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989, the disappearance of the socialist states of Eastern Europe, from Poland in the north to Bulgaria in the south, and big changes in the People's Republic of China, all of which led socialists to ask a very important question. We have to account for, we socialists, for the fact that the Soviet Union fell apart. Why did that happen? What's wrong with the idea and the image and the program we put forward? We have never said we expected it to collapse in 60, 70 years, which is what happened in the Soviet Union. And we didn't expect the kinds of changes that we have seen over the last 25 years in the People's Republic of China. And for those that are not familiar, let me explain. China's revolution in 1949, they replicated the Soviet Union. The government went in, took over, and became the owner-operator of industry. But over the last 25 years in China, they have turned industry back over, not all of it, but a good chunk of it, to private owners, both Chinese and non-Chinese. So that American and Japanese and British firms have very big businesses, private capitalist enterprises going on inside China with the approval of the Chinese Communist Party and with their statement that doing this is part of, here's what they call it, socialism with Chinese characteristics. Okay. So a lot of socialists looked at all of that and said, wow, we share the idea that having the government merely supervise, wow, that's too moderate for us. We're not going there. That gets you the United States or Britain or France or Germany. And those are countries which for us as socialists are far too unequal, far too unstable in the sense of their business cycles, far too hierarchical in everything that goes on there, culturally oppressive of large numbers of people, etc. So that's not acceptable to us. But we're also worried because what happened in the Soviet Union and in China under that second kind of socialism, that doesn't thrill us either, because there the mistake was you gave way too much power to the government. to give them the control of the military and then also of the entire economic apparatus, enabled a relatively small number of people in top government positions to basically rule the society, denying people certain basic civil liberties and freedoms, the critique, of course, of those societies that was made from the West. These are socialists for whom that's important. They have to explain it. But even more important than that, and make them critical, was the fact that it didn't survive, that it caved in on itself, which suggests there may have been some very serious problems. And the way these folks put it is that if socialists do not adequately explain what went wrong, both in the mild socialism, just have the government supervise, or the more aggressive socialism, have the government take over and operate, if we, the socialists, don't make a critique of them, then the only critique out there will be by people who hate socialism. We can't let that happen. We have to be able to articulate a socialist, or if you like, a Marxist critique of things that happen in the name of Marxism or socialism with which we disagree, and how and why that still leaves us as socialists. All right, so that gets me then to the third one, which has emerged, in the last 40 years, more or less. Here comes the idea. What was wrong with the moderate socialism of the first kind and with the more aggressive socialism of the second kind, the kind put into place by people who called themselves communists? They both had a blind spot. They both didn't see something they could have and they should have seen and attended to. The problem was they focused on what in economics we call macro level issues, issues about the society as a whole. Who owns the means of production? Who distributes the resources and the products? And they came up with definitions of socialism focused on that. But here's what they didn't care much about, did not write much about, and did not agitate around much, namely the internal organization of the enterprise. Whether the owners, operators are private persons or state officials, that's an interesting question. That will make a difference. But it leaves completely unspoken what is the relationship in the enterprise between whoever calls the shots at the top and the vast majority of people working in any enterprise, which are the employees. Could be hired by a private company, could be hired by a state enterprise. But in the end, we have kept the employer-employee distinction. And so now here comes what is really quite new for many people. For these socialists, that relationship, employer to employee, that is the core of capitalism. And you have not gotten beyond capitalism unless and until you have replaced that relationship with something fundamentally different. And before I explain exactly that, I'm going to give you a historical analogy, because that's how socialists reason. Mm-hmm. So long as you have in production a relationship in which one group of people, a minority, are called masters, and the other group, a majority, are called slaves, because they are literally owned either by the masters or by some third party. As long as you have that, whatever else you do, you've got slavery. It really doesn't matter in the main whether the master is a private citizen or a government official. If you look at the history of slavery, we've had private slavery and we've had state slavery. The same logic applies to feudalism. You have the lord and the serf. We've had private feudal manners, and we have had lords and serfs on a private manner, and we've had lords and serfs where the lord is the king, is the sovereign, is the state. By the way, historians, I've never read a historian who says if the state becomes the major slaveholder, it isn't slavery anymore. It's something else.
Right.
And I never heard anyone tell me that if the King of France had a lot of serfs, and therefore there's state serfdom, that therefore we don't have feudalism. Nobody argues that. It's only in capitalism, which is so bizarre, that we're supposed to believe that if the state employs people alongside private employers, then somehow we have a new system or a different system, or maybe even socialism. For these socialists, that's a basic, theoretical, analytical, political dividing line. For this third group of socialists, you don't have socialism unless you have overcome, erased, ended the employer-employee relationship. Therefore, if the state replaces a private entity as the employer, you don't have socialism, you have state capitalism. And that distinction means that the other kinds of socialism are not adequate for this new kind. Everybody understands that they're going to still use the term socialism. There is no agency that issues certificates as to who can call themselves a socialist and who can't. But I'm just explaining this third group believes it has found the flaw, if you like, in the other two. That this third group is very open to planning, to government ownership. It's just that's a secondary issue for them. That's not what they're primarily concerned with. They're much more concerned with how have you organized the productive enterprises, the people the adult people who are healthy, who are sane, who do the work, who make the goods and services, who sell them in the store, who work in the offices. And you only have socialism if you, and here comes the punchline, if you socialize the enterprise. No more master-slave, no more lord-serf, but here it comes, no more employer-employee. Instead, enterprises should, if they're going to be called socialist, be organized in a fundamental, horizontal, democratic way. Everyone in an enterprise, whether you are a trained engineer or you sweep the floor or you park the cars, one person, one vote in deciding the major issues of the enterprise. What they're going to produce, what technology they're going to use, where the production is going to occur, and here comes the big one. What is going to be done with the fruits of the collective coordinated labor? That doesn't mean you don't give specialists particular responsibilities. If they know more than the rest of us, sure. It doesn't mean that everybody gets paid the same dollar amount.
Right.
But it's up to the democratic decision to pay some people more, some people less, to give these people responsibility because they have certain skills that either others don't have or haven't acquired yet. All of those things will be worked out, just as capitalists had to work out all the arrangements for capitalist enterprises. But the idea here is, if we did that, we would have created the foundation, finally, for a democratic society. That the failure of capitalism as we know it, and of moderate socialism, and of the communist version of socialism, they all claimed they were going to bring us liberty, equality, fraternity, democracy, and they meant it. Those leaders who led the revolutions, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, they meant those things. I'm not being Monday morning quarterback here. Mm-hmm. But they didn't understand that the capitalist system, which they thought would bring those things with it, wouldn't do that. That in fact, capitalism would turn out to be an obstacle to achieving the very things it said it was for. And that's what socialism is. How do we get to the very objectives that capitalists set for themselves but didn't achieve? We want to achieve it, and we think the radical reorganization, democratization of the workplace is what was missed by our forebears and what the new socialism has to put as profound a part of what it's about as anything having to do with what the state does relative to the private. And that it's been, let me end with this, it's been a terrible mistake to allow the major debate in Western capitalism for the last century to be this endless debate, is more government better or worse than less government? That detracts from the issue that should have been debated. Is capitalism the best we can do, or can we do better than that? That is now coming back, which is partly why we have this program now. And I'm very grateful that that's happening. But I think you have to call out that it was, I'm trying to be polite now, a very clever ploy of the capitalists, whether they understood it or not, to have us debating all the time, more or less government, less government, because what it left unspoken was the notion that the only conceivable way to organize an enterprise is the way we have now, in which a tiny minority of people, the owners, the major shareholders, the top executives, have absolute control over everybody else in the enterprise, the absolute opposite of democracy, and yet nobody says anything because we have kind of all agreed that capitalism and democracy are synonyms, and socialists are the ones that say, oh no.
Yeah, it's the ultimate Tina situation. It's the ultimate, there is no alternative. And so what you have to left to bicker over is whether or not the state is going to exploit people or if private individuals are going to exploit people. I mean, to me, this is going back to Marx, basic Marxist principles. That what you have to look at is not the role of the state in terms of how deep it is involved in the current economic system, but whether or not it is maintaining the current economic relations of production and those kinds of things, the way that production is being done. And I think the state capitalist argument that you've sort of outlined is essentially saying, look at the relationships, look at production in the Soviet Union and in China and places like that, and show me where the workers were running those industries.
Right.
And the thing for me to me that's the obvious answer is they weren't. That you had bosses and managers who were outside of the enterprises who would give them essentially orders and quotas, and you had to fill these, and you weren't deciding production based on a democratic model, but you were deciding based on a planning model for sure, but not one that was fundamentally democratic. So the thing for me is the discussion that I'll often have is, with the sort of dyed-in-the-wool Marxist-Leninist who will say, no, the Soviet Union and Maoist China are representations of socialism because you have workers owning the means of production through the state and through the Communist Party that sort of runs it and is, and leads the working class. What is the kind of response that you would have to somebody who argues that if you got a Communist Party that's in power, then it is the representation of at least the most advanced version of the working class, and so if it owns the means of production, then it's workers owning the means of production.
Sure, no, I've heard that argument a million times too. There's a variety of ways to go at that. One way, which is perfectly legitimate, is to really do a detailed examination of how the Communist Party was organized. Mm-hmm. Did it, in fact, collect, reflect, enact what the average Russian worker felt, needed, or wanted? I don't think it would take you very long to see that that was not the case. Another way to go at it is to draw an analogy. There are quite a few companies here in the United States that have what are called ESOPs, employee stock ownership plans or programs. Basically, what that involves is that workers, either directly or through their pension money, buy shares in their own company. Okay. Are there some who then get a majority of the shares owned by workers? Yes, we have quite a few of those. The workers then are the owners. But here's what workers do. They don't feel adequate. They don't feel educated. They don't feel able to manage. They believe that management and control are separate functions that they lack, for which you need an MBA or something else like that. And they want to have their company properly managed. And so they look around, and guess who they hire to be on their board of directors? People who have long experience in private capitalist businesses, because where else are you going to get the experience?
Yeah.
And then they hire them, and what you begin to see is, and I'm not arguing it makes no difference. Yeah, it does. If the workers have the votes for the majority of shares, they can and on occasion will exercise some power. So it's different from if you exclude workers. In the United States, you basically exclude workers. In Germany, there's a law. It's called Mitbestimmung, which in German means determining with. Here's the rule in Germany. Any enterprise that has 2,000 or more workers, the workers themselves must elect roughly 45% of the board of directors members. All right? That gives workers a direct control. By the way, it has nothing to do with owning. The workers don't have to own anything. They get that by law. Okay, that's extraordinary. And that has made a difference in Germany. But boy, has it not undone Germany's capitalist character. It means there's a much closer coordination between workers and capitalists. Workers know what the capitalist is about to do long before they otherwise would. They understand what the issues facing the company, all kinds of benefits that are worth fighting for. But it doesn't change, again, that there's a mass of people producing a surplus for a very small number of people who have the dominant say as to what is done with that surplus, and therefore create a society with this extraordinary power and this extraordinary wealth concentrated in this small group of people's hands. Germany reeks of all of that 12 ways to Sunday. So I think you could show that workers owning something has to mean something real and tangible. And it probably has to mean something real and tangible at the level of the enterprise. I mean, either we're going to give the workers, when I get into my more rhetorical moments, I will say something like this. If you want a society to serve the workers, you got to put them in control. There is no shortcut. If you want workers to be the foundation of your society, democratically able to control it, then they have to have that financial power that's now in the hands of the capitalists. Every time the government tries to do something, it has to go to the business community to raise the taxes. It has to go to the business community to get the personnel. And it's going to a community that is insular, that is a minority, and that sits at the top of a pyramid. Either that stops or it doesn't. And the only way to stop it is to say, no, every enterprise is now going to be, think of it this way, a kind of triumvirate. On the one hand, all the workers, one person, one vote, they have a say. Next, all the customers, the people who buy the product and who depend on the work, they too have to have a say. And number three, the people who live in that area, the residents, who have to live with what comes out of the smokestack of the enterprise, or whose family members work there and bring home whatever the grief is of the enterprise. You have to have a co-determination by the workers as a group, by the community, residential community as a group, and by the customers. I'm sure we can work that out, and that will put not just the numerical votes of all of those people as voters, but the institutionalized economic power of wealth likewise in those people's hands. No intermediate group, not a master, not a lord, not an employer, not a king, not a this, the workers themselves. That's the issue. And for socialists of this new kind, that's the central issue. They're willing to be allied with socialists who want planning or government ownership, because for them, they can work out all kinds of deals with that, because whether it's private or public, for them the issue is who controls, who makes the decisions. Do we finally let me take a step back, Kevin, particularly for American audiences. We do something remarkable here in the United States, not only here, but we say everybody gets a vote. In November, everybody gets a vote.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Joe, who has dug holes all his life, gets a vote. Mary, who's a nurse, gets a vote. John, who's a factory owner, gets a vote. This one got to vote, never went to school in his life. This one has a PhD. That's a very radical. We didn't allow, and by the way, there were big fights about this. We didn't allow there to be selective voting, depending on whether you were this, that, or the other thing. No, we said there has to be a kind of baseline democracy. And why aren't we doing that in the enterprise? Does it slow us down? A bit. Sure it does. No pain, no gain. You lose something if everybody is equal. But you gain something that is indefinable but very, very important. It was so important that we've done it in this country now for quite some time. It took a long time before we let black people vote or women vote, or we know all that story. But finally, we got to the point where everybody kind of understands it has to be, since we're all affected by what the decisions are, whether we have a PhD or a high school diploma, and therefore, because we're all affected, that trumps everything else. We have to participate. I agree with that, but that makes me a socialist, because I don't understand why we ever let the economic aspect of our life be exempted from this rule. If it's good to be democratic in politics, please explain to me what in the world made us exempt the economic sphere. And the answer is the capitalists who didn't want to lose their privileged position. There
Exactly.
is no other reason. It has hurt politics to have democracy in a variety of ways. The critics of democracy always knew that and pointed it out. It will hurt our economy in a number of ways to democratize it, but it will also give us priceless social inclusion that we could never have any other way.
Yeah, I've always, I've made the sort of claim that, when you look at the change in the People's Republic of China to a more market, a more capitalist sort of mode, what you actually saw was the fundamental authoritarian nature of capitalism linking up with an authoritarian political system. And I think one of the fetters to capitalism has been there's this idea in political science that capitalism and democracy go together, that they arose together, they come out of the same traditions, that the liberty part of the French Revolution was political liberty, and so but that you had capitalism that came out at the same time. So because these things historically come together, there is this idea that they are fundamentally linked. But the irony is that capitalism is a fundamentally authoritarian system in which there's a certain people at the top who make decisions and the people at the bottom have no say. And if you look at a democratic governmental system with a capitalist economy, that democratic system is a fetter onto the capitalist system, which is why capitalists then do everything they can to limit the participation of the rabble so that they can maintain their hegemony as much as they can. But in China, you have this perfect link between an authoritarian government and the authoritarian capitalist system, and look at the products of it. It's one of the most advancing economies in the world. It's got double-digit GDP growth. I mean, this is showing that capitalism can be productive, but is unleashed in its productivity if it's done under an authoritarian regime rather than a democratic regime. And so if we're talking about democracy, the only real democratic system that you can have, the irony is I have Democracy at Work's shirt on right now, that democracy is only real democracy when it's at the workplace. Right. And the democracy that isn't at the workplace is a kind of false democracy. I had this conversation just the other day where, given the situation right now, are you going to vote for Donald Trump? Or are you going to vote for Joe Biden? And it's bringing out in a lot of people's mind, especially a lot of Bernie supporters, the fundamental flaw of bourgeois elections. And it harkens back to the sort of, the Marx quote that bourgeois elections are just the ability for every couple of years for the masses to decide who's going to exploit them.
Exactly.
So the fact that we don't have a fundamental democratic system in our workplaces makes any kind of fake democratic system other places that much less tangible and less actually affecting in our lives. And that's why the majority of vote in the United States, at least in any election, is I didn't vote, because it makes the vote that you do have even less important, and so it doesn't matter.
If I could go even further, and before I do, Kevin, just because I have a problem at 6:00, I have to stop. It does not mean we can't continue this. We would have to continue it at a different time, which
Sure.
I'd be glad to do. If you want to go further, I'm more than happy to do it, but I can't do it beyond the next 4 or 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Let me respond here to
Sure.
several things, because they're very, very important. One of the reasons, now let me take it back. A major reason that Donald Trump is still the president of the United States is because the American military and the big business community like him. They value him.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you have to face, whoever we're talking to has to understand why that is. And it's because of what you said about China. The military and the business community are very clear that the Chinese system of a kind of mixed private and state capitalist enterprise as the economy and a powerful authoritarian political structure are proving themselves to be able to grow economically faster than the United States for every one of the last 25 years, and it's not even close.
Mm-hmm.
And they've now proved it again by having been able to mobilize both public and private resources to defeat this virus better and faster than the United States was able to do. Donald Trump is a kind of stalking horse to see whether something comparable can be organized here, and it would be a big mistake not to see it. My second point is to go back to something you said, very, very important. I think in a very profound way, which can't be articulated, but is nonetheless real, that huge number of Americans who don't care about politics, who don't bother to vote, who don't inform themselves, when the radio or TV brings political news, they go to the bathroom or they go get a beer or whatever. Mm-hmm. I think those people do that for a variety of reasons that are not important, but here's an important one. They don't think it matters all that much. They don't think that what happens in their daily life, what happens the day after the November election, is going to be all that much different if Biden gets it or if Trump gets it. And in that lies a great deal of truth. They've been around these people often for many years. They've seen this one win and that one lose, and they don't think it may. And we can tell them all day long it does, but that's not their life that it does. Their life is that it doesn't.
Yeah.
Now imagine, here's the power of that. That's because these politicians haven't been willing to change anything fundamental. But we are. What might happen to an American electorate which saw a political party saying, hey, here's what we're going to do. It's going to change your work. Every day, Jack, every day, Jill, you're going to have 2 job definitions. The particular task you do, plus your seat on the board that decides everything about this company, what it is, where it's going, You're not going to just be a drone. You're not just going to be a worker bee. You're not just going to come in every day and be focused mostly on lunch and happy hour, because you're going to have something here that engages your talents, excites you, shows you possibilities, allows you to come up with something that can change the lives of yourself and all your coworkers. You're in a different position. This is a wholly new idea. For this to be defined as socialism is also a way around the anti-socialist ideology that's been pumped into people's heads. We are not advocating the government do anything. Mm-hmm. All your arguments about why the government can, fine. Got nothing to do with it. It's like arguing, whether purple is a nicer color than yellow. I don't care. You feel that way. That's not what I'm about. I mean, it's an interesting discussion I'll have with you tomorrow. But here's what I want to talk to you about. And they don't have the defenses for that, which gives us an enormous advantage. And so I see a possibility with this kind of socialism growing out of the failures of the other. Anyway, I've come to the end of the hour I have for today.
Yeah.
Can I leave it up to you since I have to get off? Could you think about it? If you want to continue this, get in touch with me. We'll set it up and we'll do it again. Especially soon, because this lockdown gives me the time and the opening to do it. I presume it's true for you too, and maybe it's something we can take advantage of.
Absolutely, yeah, because I do have a lot. You teased it a little bit there in terms of having a party that would be able to talk about those kind of things, especially in the wake of Bernie Sanders getting out and that possibility. I'd love to talk to you about that. So yeah, we'll do a part 2, but this is a good part 1. So thanks for doing it, and we'll talk soon. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Sensible Socialist podcast. This podcast is supported by listeners like you, and no advertisements or anything will ever be said. If you want to support the podcast, please go to patreon.com/sensiblesocialist and give today. Also, please give us a review or a rating on iTunes or wherever you listen to the podcast, as it greatly helps. All right, see you next time.